some of their field offices don't have adequate enough staffing or areas to support. So we have the Land Department, the Preservation Office, EPA, NDOT, NCBG, Division of Community Development, VA. As the money with ARPA, there is allowable costs in there that can look at billing those areas, but it looks at the stakeholder partner activities to really move forward. Because as I mentioned earlier, we have monies available through transportation, money through child care development, money available through health, hospitals, clinics. All of those areas play into the role into rebuilding the community. There's a preliminary proposed budget that we have on slide 6. These are just some of the areas that we found that we have the 2 development sites, 50 homes for rentals. That's what's kind of coming out. I'll go into some demographics and then down the presentation. Home ownership. We have upgrades, new and upgrades of infrastructure. There's several subdivisions that we have that have available area to bill out on, but we need to upgrade the sewer lagoons or the water distribution to those sites, just because add units to them. There's an area here that's been echoing for the last 3 weeks is rehab, modernization activities. We have an area there that we've set a program up. Now it's honing down how we're going to hit that program, who's going to be the recipients and how. Ventilation improvements for some of our public rentals of our 1937. These are some houses that are over 40 years old that need some the changes there. And there's a real estate property acquisition, putting some money in there in case we have some areas for right-of-ways, area that we have to have money available to process some of those areas. The last portion is administrative area for planning activities to carry out all these programs outside of the regular Indian housing funds that we receive through NAHASDA. So there's $49.7 million. This is just a proposal yet, and we're now starting to hone down on it. On slide 7, there are very little waivers to the IHBG ARPA statutes and regulatory waivers. Or we have an income verification. They've issued a waiver, meaning that we don't have to have a physical person. Only HUD allows us to do one recertification for existing, remote income verification and self-certification over the phone. That was their own waiver that they add to it. The other thing that they put a waiver is public health services. Recipient may use the ARPA funds to carry out wide range, meaning that if we have areas there that a client in our subdivisions and they have no transportation, we can arrange transportation to go get health services through the hospital. And that's a program that they're waiving. There's no restrictions on that. The last one is the useful life, meaning that if NHA renovates a house, puts value into that house, the homeowner that we have won't have any restrictions to the IHBG ARPA funds. Meaning that in the current IHBG, there's a useful life. If we spend $5,000, $10,000 improving the house there, NHA has collateral of that site for up to 10 years. For the use of this money, if we're going to go into some of these rehab areas, the useful life is waived for that period using it. It's a one-stop or one-time funding assistance through the ARPA for there. One of the things that we were challenged with, and we were hoping that they have a little bit of leeway, was the environmental review process. Under the environmental review process for ARPA, the environmental compliance was not waived, and the requirement is that all funding associated with this program has to be evaluated. So if we're going to be doing roofing, windows, some type of replacement, we still have to go through the environmental testings of those materials to determine if it's exempt from the environmental review, if it's category excluded, category excluded with mitigation requirements, or does it require full assessment? We were hoping that they'll have a little bit of leeway on this, but HUD did not allow any kind of area, so we still have to go through the flood evaluation, we still have to go through endangered species, we still have to go through the wetland evaluations. All of those requirements are still gonna, so it's critical as we start planning these things, looking at the activities to work with and make sure that the preservation have the staff to do these reviews. EPA have the review staff, land department, if there's some home site adjustments. And it's using this ARPA money to figure out how can we assist programs to offset and get the individual to support them. There's slide 9. I have, I'm not sure, Mr. Franklin, are you on?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, can you go over to slide 9 on your housing strategy?
Okay. Speaker Damon, can you hear me?
Yes, the floor is yours.
Okay, ja tegen distinto. Che ja Ernest Franklin, yes, le bas latte are na shadow na kaina was is chindo ki ani einsle. So okay, that's another do put it chini that's a che. That's it that they think. Division director, without a yes and none, it's just an us and could NHA. Di bahoni snagi a ya di ala one does nigi do ala not for kada inigi she without organic as yo what bahwa sneh. Good afternoon, members of the committee, Naabik'íyáti committee, and also Honorable Seth Damon. What we have here is what we call the Housing and Community Development Strategy. One of the big things that we've been pushing for is the sharing of data across the board. Yesterday, you heard from land department about loss of data and people not sharing data and things being lost and without data, you kind of have to work in like working in the dark. I always say that a mapping system is what turns on the light so you can actually see what's going on out there. So what we're trying to do is we want to reevaluate the Navajo Nation's baseline housing needs and related demographics. There was a comment by Dr. Perlman about or Yellowman about NHA's previous housing need assessment that was done quite a while ago. A lot of that stuff was taken from a third party consultant that was hired at that time, but things have changed and houses have gone from one condition to the next. So we have developed an application that can actually pinpoint people out there, get family composition, get income data, get the type of housing that's out there, how many bedrooms there are there, how many bathrooms, the square footage, what conditions the houses are, things like that can help us make decisions. So we can start to build a housing data platform to be used with all different kinds of users, GIS users out there. We have several GIS users, Geographical Information System users out there. And currently, we really don't share data with each other. You have NTOA that has all the utility systems. You have NDOT that has the transportation systems. You have the Navajo Nation Division of Natural Resources that has all the water data, the wells, the soil conditions, things like that. And then you also have NHA here with our housing data. You have BIA that has land status. You have, in conjunction with Navajo Land Administration, they also have land status. And then you have IHS. IHS has a lot of data on water capacity and water analysis that they use to do their design systems out there for residential clients. And what we want to do, what we're proposing, is that we all start sharing data on one common platform, and that we can start making informed based decisions. That's kind of what this slide is all about here. The next slide. Can we go to the next slide?
So, Ernest, there's only one slide to there on the baseline data. So the point of presentation here is that we have a lot of things going on in the reservation and want to do with the money that's coming in, and we got to interweave everything. So if we have that information, we can really lay out the areas of how housing is going to be applied to these areas in terms of the transportation. They mentioned earlier about land status from Ms. Yellowman. The utility, where do we have a capital improvement for utilities? This will actually really steer the area of discussion and how we're going to roll this out in the next 3 years. So the criticalness of this baseline data and demographics, on my next slide is going to be demographics, is us having that information to make a quantified decision. All of us, I mean, not just NHA, community development, NGOA, IHS, we all know what we're doing. We all have an idea of where do we need to gear up in staffing, where do we need to gear up resources? Do we have to start looking at areas of the partnerships like Mr. Kealan mentioned, bringing in people for light up? How do we need to get that going? Because I know that with BEP, for the BIA, they're building a new school in Lukachukai, and they've been actively asking us how we're going to fund our utility infrastructure. So this data is really critical as a point that kind of monitor and track and gear us as we go. So moving on to the next slide, we did some analysis of NHA public housing. As you mentioned, we have roughly over 9,000 units in part of this area. When we start pulling up data of what we have currently and looking at who utilizes these units here, the age group over 62 plus, this was an eye-opener for myself. We counted 1,657 individuals. 29% of our housing stock was occupied by individuals over 62. The average age was 80 years old. And the eye-opener on this one was that the individuals had young children that they had on their rental agreements, that they were caring for 3 to 4 children. The next age group of 55 to 61, we had roughly 770. That was roughly 13% of our housing stock. Average age was 57. The next category for age was under 55 to 18 years old. We do have a couple that are 18-year-old that are parents, young age, and they live in they're heavily subsidized. But in this group here, there was a little over 3,285 individuals. And it looked at this portion here was roughly about 28%. Average age was 41. So when you start looking at these age groups, you're looking at across the board in terms of the actual application, that's another thing that we'll look at. What do we build to? Children group less than 18 years old living in NHA housing was 6,464 individuals less than 18 years old. Average age was averaging about 9 years old. So we got a heavy population of individuals under the teen level of 15. Number of families with children, 2,692. In looking at the groups of disabled, there's roughly 4,866 that are not in that category or don't need assistance. Average age 54. Individuals that do need assistance for accessibilities is over 846 individuals. That's roughly 14% of our housing stock. Average age is roughly 62. And this makes you wonder the other areas of outside of the public housing that's going to need to be captured as we roll this housing program out. The head of household gender, female, meaning that these are individuals head of household, 44,102, 71% of the housing, average age is 53. Male, 1,605, categorized about 29%. Average age, 59. So when you look at these areas here, we captured that we have in our public rental a certain age group of people over 55 years of age. About 50% of our housing stock is by individuals over 55. And one thing that as we look at the demographics, we look at the current application for housing. We blend that for people who are looking for housing. Out of a recent statistics from 2019, we've done application drive. We had a total of 1,100 applications given out. We received 8 veteran VASH assistance. Home ownership requests for subdivision, 413 individual applications. Scattered site, 86. Public rental requests for subdivision, 391. The request for both PR, HO, subdivision, 136. There was 152 that didn't return to application. So there's a need, and this is one thing that we're looking at now. What age group are we looking at for the home ownership subdivision? Are they younger individuals? Since currently NHA houses 50% of our new housing stock are given to somebody over 55 years and older. Another thing that we looked at was the income brackets. Individuals making up to $5,000. We had 1,980 individuals. 31% of our housing stock were individuals who don't make over $5,000. And these ones are individuals who live off TANF food stamps, and that was their own kind of income that they come in to support them. They're the ones that get the subsidies through 1937. Individuals who make up to $10,000, 792, 13% of the housing stock. Individuals making up to $15,500, 10%. Individuals making up to $20,000 is 479. And the last category is that individuals making up to $25,390. When you look at this through the programs that have under the Indian Housing Block Grant, 75% of the housing occupants make less than $25,000 in a year, and those individuals are subsidized for utility allowances, and or out to zero rent or low rent, meaning they pay no more than $75 to $100 a month. 25% of them make over $25,000 is $1,400, and this goes up to the income limits up to $40,000. So when you look at this and looking at, all right, we have ARP money, which is a one-time thing for housing assistance. It comes making the conclusion, determination, we can provide the assistance in housing across the board somewhere at the locations that are most feasible and suitable. But all of us, we need to be mindful that these individuals that we're helping, we talked about earlier discussion of these individuals don't have the money to maintain. The program has to have some mechanism in there for the sustainability. Sustainability is how this ARP, when we provide housing, to keep the longevity of those houses occupied and up to livable conditions, because there's not going to be any subsidies that are being handed on through this program. So that's something that we've been looking at. How are we going to roll this out if majority of under our 9,000 units that we have, and then our public rental of 3,000 make less than 25,000. So those are some of the areas that need to be looked at, because this ARP, when under the HUD stuff, has income restrictions, but the stuff that's outside of the HUD does not. And if we use those monies, we need to figure out a strategy how some of those individuals who make less than 25,000 are very needy. How do we continue to provide service? And that's something that's going to be at a legislative level, a governmental level. That leadership needs to look at that as something, because we put somebody in the house, but how is it going to be sustained? And that's going to foster in all the different areas that's mentioned in this recovery plan. Businesses, roads, all of that. Moving on to slide 12, there's a couple of locations of possible new development related to American Rescue. We looked at some of the areas we've done. In the first, we identified a tier system of possible location across the Navajo Nation that we've been working on, but we had struggles with infrastructure. And this is the reason why we have some monies in there on the ARP to probably build out these units. We have a project site out in Steamboat, 20-unit subdivisions. It needs a new sewer lagoon. It needs a water booster station for water. But for the calculations that were coming out, we only had 10 units, but we're actually working around that. That's on our tier sheets of building out. We're looking at some of the subdivisions that have openings to do infill lots, that have utility capacity to build in there, that can meet some of the requests for maybe a home ownership subdivisions. Kayenta, we have some areas there, we got utilities back, and that's the areas that we know we can roll out some units. Shanto, this was one of our projects 3 years ago, but it was pushed back because we had areas of concerns regarding the sewer system. We required a lift station. So we're looking at that the sewer lagoon system area, the only thing nearer that community was the school sewer system. So we worked through those areas, and if we have money to expand, go through ARP, those are some of the first tier. The second possible locations that we're looking at is the Coal Mine Mesa. We've requested information from NQA, so our staff are looking at what the information that was provided regarding utility capacity for units that we need to put out there. We have a site out in Pineo for 30. There could be more, but we're looking at the utility capacity. If there's what would cost for infrastructure to improve that whole network of the community system. Huh?
You're one slide behind.
So the second tier kind of has projects. I know there's some projects that we had out there, everybody brings up as the hot. That project there, because of we have monies that can be put out there for the infrastructure, which we're back on talks with NQA on the actual rollout. The last project there that we're talking about is Tohatchee, New Mexico. There's an old BI school property there that can be re-renovated to where it can put new subdivision housing in that community and redevelop Tohatchee. Adding 40 plus units is a good possibility. It's filling out the infrastructure there. So we put everything together, there's over 200 units. And it's not a lot of units, but those are some of the stuff we have in the tier ships that are in the works. We had over 32 sites, and we're still reevaluating with NQA. But with the money we have now is establishing the pre-planning. If we get a lot of that done in a lot of the areas, those are some areas that can be turned over through the ARP. But it's going to take some areas of recommendation. It's my last slide. My recommendations that build the internal governmental key divisions departments with human resources that are critical, that are entrusted by the government for approvals. Land office at the field level, the historic preservation office, the environmental offices, the fish and wildlife, water resources, and every other areas that apply. Under ARP, you can have those planning administration costs set up to where these programs can be billed straight to those activities and not impede on the travel general funds account. And this can cover a 3-year while Navajo Nation looks at other ways of offsetting the shortfalls. Another recommendation that I have is the construction of some of the new tribal facilities, offices with the funds, because it's allowable within the ARP for the rebuilding of government. There's some offices I heard several presentations ago that are dilapidated, old, not being in use. I think one of the things that was discussed a while back is the service delivery to our tribal members. Going hand in hand with this ARP money, I think that's one of the things is building those capacities so we can have individuals. The next recommendation is improving our internal tribal review process. As I believe my staff was telling me from Land Department, they incorporated an internal process to gauge the timeline, but we still have struggles with the 164. There's certain areas that if it's going through that of tier ships, how can we get those approved? If it's an updating of a lease right away, service line, something. How do we streamline those? And those are improving that system to where we can get all of this area. Procurement. I know tribal procurement when I used to work there was a struggle because all big, large contracts have to go through the president's office. Maybe the nation under the financial system controller identify some contracting officers to handle certain activities at certain limits of approvals. In the last recommendation, identify our vital natural resource supplies. If we're going to do out roads in a lot of this area, we need the gravel and borrow pits. We need them because, as we mentioned, everything is brought onto the reservation from border towns. That sustainability is real critical for us. Upgrading our utility systems. by those resources. The construction supply chain to support the recovery plan for infrastructure. How do we get some of that area? At 1 year, we were looking at a governmental or agency agreement with White River before they had their big fire to see if we can have supplies from their mill. I'm not sure if they're back in operation. That's one thing that we could look at, is acquiring White River lumber. They have several different grades of Douglas fir, which will offset some of these chain costs that are increasing. One thing that we got to be mindful on, and I hear this from several conversations, because of a lot of our building materials coming in from Canada. Canada hasn't opened their trade agreement because of COVID. OSB, half-inch OSB has risen 100 or 221%, coming from a cost of $14 a sheet to $45 a sheet. The other area that we're facing a lot of increases is interior doors. It's at an 80% increase. Refrigerators. This morning on Good Morning America, there was a national home builder recommending to people watching that do not look at renovating this year because of high demands of material and short supplies of appliances. We see a big shortage of refrigerators for us, for our public rentals. They get damaged. We have a wait time of 3 to 4 months on parts because the manufacturer for 1 year was stalled. So we keep monitoring these, and because under our IHBG block grant, we have a total development cost we have to stay under. And we've done a verbal request to HUD requesting clarification if HUD's going to issue a waiver on the total development cost for projects across the reservation. It's like Mr. James from Veterans. You buying your concrete in Gallup for $7,000 to pour a 1,200 square foot house, and then you haul it to Chin Lee, you're going to be paying 50% more just for transportation costs and mobilization. The further we go out to those rural areas, it goes higher. And this is going to be the thought pattern through NECA, through some of the collaboration, NQA or minerals. How do we get the resources to build these batch plants out there on some of these areas that are going to be developed in some of these communities and rural areas? And it's identifying those vital natural resources, supply chains, so we don't have to go buy it from Gallup. We don't have to go buy it from Flagstaff. We don't have to buy it from Farmington. We have our sustainability to support these developments. I know over the years, and we've been hearing this Bill Navajo, use Navajo. I think it's at this time to really roll up our sleeves and look at those areas. Speaker Damon, I'm going to end with that and take questions. I hope that information I gave to you is beneficial and useful. Thank you, sir. Speaker?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Wasetta, and thank you very much for your presentation. Most importantly, thank you very much for bringing those recommendations too as well for the process. And thank you very much for the overview on what we need to do and the overall outcome of what we could possibly. And then also, thank you very much to Mr. Franklin. Good to hear your voice. Sounds like you're out in the field. So thank you very much for the whole presentation that you did before us here today. So with that, colleagues, Is there any comments, questions right now for Mr. Wasetta? I don't have anybody in the queue, do you? Nobody's in the queue right now.
Speaker, this is Delegate Brown.
Yes, Honorable Brown, go ahead.
Yeah, Nana. Yeah, thank you, Speaker. And again, colleagues, as we're all aware on the Navajo Nation, today is the National Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Day, also recognized by President Biden from the White House. I understand that there's also walks that will be happening, and including, I know that Delegate Crotty sent that information out. So I know that we are all exposed to this, and we have relatives. I myself, this day I'm sitting here and not just on this day, but before, thinking of my older sister who was brutally and violently taken from us. How much that still impacts my family to this day. So it is a day where we remember our relatives who have been violently taken from us, our people, and statistics show overwhelming amount of our people. So my question to Navajo Housing Authority is, I know that, hold on. Thank you. So my question to Navajo Housing Authority, again, thank you for the presentation. I know that there are a lot of fundings coming to the Navajo Nation for housing for our Navajo people here on the nation. My first question again would be to, when I met with NHA Board of Commissioners a couple of weekends ago, I did ask about the federal mandate on the federal poverty income guideline, and how has NHA done any research or data collection on how that's impacting our Navajo families. I think there's this mentality also of keeping our people in a poverty mentality. I've heard people say, well, I can't apply for the job, or I turned down a job because I really want that Navajo Housing Authority house. I want that house. If I get a job, then I won't be eligible. And it's vice versa for individuals or Navajo people who are employed, can never be eligible for these housing, the way this guideline is. And my next step to segue into this question, how can we fix this? To the board members, I did ask this question on how we can, is it a federal mandate? Does this have to be, would it be only a change at the HUD level, for these NAHASDA funding, or can our Board of Commissioners, the NHA BOC members, bring effect and change to this federal income guideline? Or would this have to be a congressional effort to change this, or to meet halfway on some of these, again, self-determination? How can we have more sweat equity projects? I know previously NHA did have some sweat equity projects, but still following the stringent guidelines was stopping a lot of people from true sweat equity, having our people help in the process in building these homes, these houses for their families. How can we, and the other part to NHA funding and the HASDA funding is, when I was in DC a few years ago, I was lobbying for NHA dollars. And when we attended a Senate committee hearing, I did meet a few other tribes who approached me and asked me how much money we had, how much does NHA have? Apparently they knew that we had a lot of money that is just sitting there. And the amount of people that need homes on the Navajo Nation, particularly families who are in vulnerable situations, who do not have the funds. So these other tribes said that, oh, you know what, our tribe we can take some of your money because we're always in the red. We always spend, actually, and that's are HUD dollars. That's how we're getting more Nahaza dollars. And they actually said, you Navajo put too much regulations on top of what HUD already provides. You tend to put more policies and laws that actually prevent you from spending these dollars. I'm wondering how true these statements are from NHA and from your board, from your attorneys. What would be the next steps on changing some of these so we can help lobbying for more dollars? And then with these coming fundings, how can we expedite? Again, all these questions go back to expediting the process on building homes. And again, whenever we meet NHA, I always recommend, I have one of my chapters who has over 100, has 150 acres withdrawn. It is prime, it is ready for any type of development in Denahutso. We have that land-based land that's right there. I know in Kayenta, within the township boundaries, we do have land that's there also. Actually not within the township, but it's within the Kayenta community, Kayenta chapter boundary area. So we do have a lot of our people who constantly are requesting, and we have to tell them we just have a little bit of money for housing discretionary funds within the chapter. Maybe NHA, can you give some funding to chapters for housing discretionary? I know a lot of our people basically need, with the amount of wind that we get, there are roofs that are blowing off. There are modular homes that are blowing apart. And you know, during the winter, we do have some of our people whose houses actually, unfortunately, burned down also. So these are the constant impact that we see and we witness at the local level. And again, I will continue to do my part in bringing collaborative efforts in strategic planning, really for the long run also, on how to bring housing to our Navajo people. And this would include writing grants and also working with universities and 501c3s that are Navajo owned and created also. We want to help Navajo Housing Authority. We want to help you. The last thing we want to see, you know, former Senator John McCain did really push NHA on spending some of these funds, and there was some misuse that was brought up as well. Again, it's really unfortunate with it. We're very lucky to have all this money, yet it's unfortunate that we cannot seem to spend the money fast enough, because we do see the dire need for homes. I do see people out there who are multi-generational homes. The last family that I visited, it was families besides COVID, besides you know, substance abuse. This family had multiple people who had very contagious sicknesses that they were giving to each other, and they had nowhere to go. So they had no choice but to give this sickness, contagious sickness. I think it was some form or strain of hepatitis, because they didn't have running water, and they only had this little house, and they had to stay and share in this little house. So these are the type of sickness that we perpetuate without building houses for our families. And I can give you numerous stories upon where we see where housing is so important. So I'm really interested in, I know that the board and with the high turnover rate of the CEOs with NHA, I know that you're doing your best. My question to you again would be, how can we help you as 24th Navajo Nation Council? Where at the first of all, it would be, where at the nation level can we help you? What policies would you like us to change? After that, where in the Nahaza dollars policy can we affect change by changing some of that language, amending some of that, and then at the HUD level, and then at the federal level. So those are all the different areas. And I understand that, you know, with TDHE, is that really cumbersome? Should that be given to another organization? Should Navajo Nation take that? Or should there be another organization created to expedite these processes. So, and then what about the lock system? How is that working? So, and some of these policies are created by non-Native American, non-Navajo people who seem to have created just to make us chase our tail around in circles and to also fight amongst ourselves. And it seems like it's accomplishing that really well. So those are some long-winded questions. Again, if you can please respond to these very important questions so I can take these response back to, then these are the questions that are coming from my chapters. These are the questions coming from our people that are always asking me about just housing in general. Hajala daiste, haishna beso, as yusan nalo, kun the Hawanda taten, tankes ninhidene, didi quagi, tankidene chedahaniske, you know. Some of them are at shelters, some of them are stuck out there and they can never go home. So these are the type of instances that we see as elected council delegates. So again, we're here. How can we help? How can we work together? Thank you. And I appreciate your presentation. Yeah.
Thank you, Honorable Brown. With that, we'll go back to you, Mr. Wasetta, and your team members.
I'm back on. Thank you for the questions, Honorable Brown. One of the key things on here is, like we mentioned, the income limits, and like the question that was posed to ICBG is how do you balance that out? Well, we have within the NHA, there is an area of checklists that we use that we don't count incomes to make people qualify under the 80% income, medium income requirements. How do we change that? I think this has been a big, long questions over the years since I've been with the Housing Authority and management capacity. I know Mr. Honorable Walter Phelps tried to push this legislation change in Washington. But I think those are some of the areas, but I think at one point too, it's unfortunate that a lot of the programs, federal programs that come out are all funded based for low income. The one things that I see that smaller tribes, and this is back in 2019, I was back in Washington during the tribal leader visits. I met with some of those individuals. One of the things I see with some of the smaller tribes that do not acquire a lot of the IHBG funds is they leverage through New Market, the CDFI programs that they have to assist individuals that are non-low income. Tax credits. We have one project that we've done in tax credit for Housing Authority, which is out in Jedito. And we had a 20-year requirement on there. That tax credit, we got a little over $1 million. But when we look at the actual money that we put in to subsidize that project, we spent probably a little over $20 million over 20 years doing the operation maintenance and the administrative for that program. But there's an idea that's been looking at how does Housing Authority go from a governmental structural housing entity to a developer housing program to provide services like what were mentioned earlier from Ms. Pearl Yellowman, Section 184, veteran loans, individual loans through some of maybe the USDA. That's one thing that we're going to need to think about to expand that. And that's a discussion that needs to look at through our change. The one thing that we need to do with our Housing Authority, and I'll echo this, we need to update our plan of operation. The plan of operation that was created, it was developed and created for Navajo Housing Authority, talks about affordable, not affordable, but low-income housing. So that was some 58 years ago, I believe. I think that this is a best time to do it this year, to really look at that plan of operation and look at the support of other programs. And how do we blend the program from ICBG through IHBG together to really look at building a one source resources for low income, but looking at another area to build in terms of mortgaging, people who can afford them. So those are one things that can happen. And that will be able to include some of the area. And this is one thing, don't get me wrong, self-determination. I know that, I think it was Honorable Daniel said about a treaty tribe versus a federal mandate tribe. Under NAHASDA, those are the things that constantly is, how do you make yourself self-determined and sustainable? And those are other areas that you bring in those capacity levels. So that's been something that been on the radar. But the plan of operation, you update it to the current standards of what here, like NECA done last summer, that will greatly enhance the opportunities to provide housing across the board to every area. And look at how do we get away from the government mentality and look into the true housing development aspects of it. The other questions that you asked about how do we change low income? I think that you're correct. Navajo Housing Authority has went through a transition from when I mentioned 87 years ago when they had the Depression. There was a program called 1937 Housing Act. It was to kickstart housing across North America. And this Housing Act was when Navajo Housing Authority at 64 built 1,000 units. And these are those HUD-style homes. As 1997, what I see is that we incorporated some old laws into new laws. And it doesn't really give us the opportunity, when you do that, to really look at self-determination. And we do dictate some of the limits. Currently, we use the law, we're using 20% of the total annual income as their base for qualifying. Under the program, they have it as 30% income. So there's areas there that we have that needs to be adjusted because of the way the program's structured. The second part is under the 1937 Housing Act program, which we're carrying a little more than, I believe it was 3,200 1937 units. Those are low-income subsidy housing, half of our housing stock. And those are the ones that we have a lot of individuals in that we pay for trash, we pay for their rental, we help them with their utility bills. When I look at in the past couple months, the subsidies that we provide every month is a little over $700,000 for these individuals. Currently, we have a little over 1,300 individuals in that zero rent program. So you look at $700,000 a month for all of these expenditures over 12 months. That's a lot of money that we use for subsidies. And this, as we look at these changes and apply some of these areas, this is an opportunity to use those monies somewhere else too. In terms of the areas of the sweat equity, as you know that during the last conversation with the board, because of the past subrecipient problem that Navajo Housing Authority had, we ended up terminating that. But the recommendation from mine and last since 2019 was we have to recreate some of these partnerships. Because I tell you this, if you have some family members or family that are invested in those homes and they actually put sweat into them, they cherish it more versus being handed a free house, or so to speak, and key, and not appreciating that. All of you all listening, if you build something and you look at it, you walk away and look at it and say, wow, you have that passion that this is what I've done. And that's where sweat equity comes in. So I think that's one key thing, is that as we roll with the program, with the ARP, this is a program that can be successful with that. And putting some of our people back to work, like I mentioned about the Public Works Administration 87 years ago. In the changes of guidelines, one of the things that we evaluate, and this is where my data, demographic data, we're looking at that. It's very true that when we start start assisting individuals, we condition our people. And I do the same thing, my own family. You start assisting them, and then they have that mentality that you're always going to help them, not having to really look at what can I do. And it's unfortunate that in culture, that's something that we have that plagues us, but how do we do that? That's something that we have to look at in some of these programs, because as you know, when Mr. Trump era, he wanted to do away with food stamps because of some of the stuff that that was being brought forward about abuse. But the only problem, it hurts the ones that are really needed, that are utilizing these programs. And one program that we're looking at for Housing Authority that we started 6 years ago, but we never finished it, was a transitional housing. Meaning that if you qualify for a public rental and you live in the public rental no more than 10 years, you have to transition to a home ownership. After the 5 years, you go through a transitional financial literacy stabilization to get qualified for home ownership too. That's something that's needed. There's other tribes that have incorporated that development phase, even in some of the Pueblos, and I believe San Domingo's doing one. It helps those individuals take the pride of the houses. So there's something that we need to look at, because as you know, some of the data demographic, we had individuals 80 years old still living in the Housing Authority house. Some of the information that I've seen, I have individuals have lived there 40 years. 40 years and paying $75 or $100 a month for a house. And that hurts me, because we didn't give an opportunity for the other individuals. But there is some changes that need to go on, and that will be incorporated as we look at the plan of operation. The areas that you were talking about, that 100 acres, I know they're in the discussion. I sent an email back asking for the location so we can look at it through Mr. Franklin's database of areas that we evaluated, some of the soil analysis, and then some of the information that we have from N2A. If you can provide that, that will help me. The other area, the last comment, or not the last, but how can you help us? I think that at one point, this is me, personal point, is that I mentioned this in my last presentation. As family, there's been areas of us growing apart. And I think by us using and combining this stuff with this, the ARP is looking at those areas to work hand in hand together. The one thing that is struggling, as you know, as you hear from yesterday's discussion, there's a lot of individuals needing home sites. A lot of individuals are those. They're mentioned that people can't afford the $30 fee or $15 fee or surveyors or the archaeology. And that tells me that these individuals may be under the $10,000 threshold that make an income. How do we use ARP money to bring them in to work? That's a challenge that we're going to have to be faced with, because society is in that point. We have conditioned individuals for a long time. But I think that's one thing that we can work on together. At the federal level, I think it's us talking unity on how we bridge the federal funds that we have now, instead of having different interpretations. And I think this an area will be supportive to have some type of training sessions of that I can work through the NIAC, the Native American Housing Organization, to provide NAHAZA trainings on all these different programs to council. Now, since it's web-based, we can set up trainings that you can log on anytime you want, just like going to school at AIRS, like ASU, you have a certain time frame you can view your training. That's one of the areas, the parts of education, how we can look at some of these programs. Second to the last question, TDHE. I know that's a hard question to answer. I know it's been pressed on a lot of people. But I think one of the things that we all need to understand is that the TDHE running this thing, the programs that if we select to be able to capabilities, must have monies, because IHBG is all based off of reimbursements, meaning that you have to have at least monies set aside in the coffer to cover at least up to 6 months or 9 months before the money comes to you. Because every year you got to have that money is available. NHA doesn't hold all this money like they say, $200 million. It's sitting at the Federal Reserve under this. It's a line of credit that they give us, and that goes hand in hand with the locks. The TDHE has the responsibility of what's going to be added to the controller of the Navajo Nation Office of Financial. Looking at the program that we have, I'm not sure where it would fit in. I know the Navajo Nation with the budget and finance is struggling to have that money available through the general funds to offset that. That would be one of the areas, the capacity levels at the area to carry on 6 months before we have money available to draw down. Currently in adding for the lock system. The lock system stands for the line of credit. Line of control credit, basically, we get annual funding sources. It's put in this line of credit, and we basically draw out of that. The drawing happens every month, and it takes up to 10 days to, sometimes up to 10 days, sometimes 2 days, depending on how much you're drawing out. And it's all on database-driven financial submittals of what you have spent. You have to show the federal government how much money you spent, fill out the documentation, certify it, send it to them, then they reimburse you. So we're currently sitting at 211,000 or 211 million. I have a little over $50 million in contract. I have 41 million going through the procurement aspects of it. That's just the monies that we've been struggling to get the infrastructure and everything in place. The current funding sources that we were awarded was 72. Majority of that has been allocated. So when you break it down into programs, there's roughly about $40 million that's set up, but we haven't went through the environmental review process to actually put those programs into motion. And that's one thing that legislators we need to understand. Before Navajo Housing Authority can spend any money, the environmental review process has to be completed. Even if we're doing administrative, if we're doing maintenance, there's two categories of maintenance for an environmental review process. Routine maintenance, if we're patching a hole, fixing the glass, and then renovation review, if we're changing the whole window, the door. It's cumbersome, but it's the federal mandate, because some of these houses that were built through the 1937 have lead paint that were painted. They have maybe some areas there with the plumbing that has asbestos still, or some tiles. So that's one of the things that we look at, that it hinders some of the lock straws, but it's getting the fundamental individuals that oversee theirs to understand and timeline those. When do we need to start it? So I think that's one of the part of the education aspects of NAHAZA, and it's a frustration, like they say, why do you have to do this? Why do I get to submit this? And I think this one point that's unfortunate, it's federal funds, and it's one of the things that are attached to it, and it is frustrating. I see it as, I always see it as a white guy bossing us around, because it doesn't, the law says self-determination, but these are the requirements. Maybe that's something that's, as we pull some of these area of challenges together, we take that back to Congress, and we want them, this is how we're going to handle it here on the reservation, on the Navajo Nation. Speaker, I hope that's answer Honorable Brown's questions. I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wasetta. Thank you very much again. Colleagues, I don't have anybody else in the queue at this time.
Because Delegate Brown has follow-up.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you again. Thank you for your response, Mr. Rosetta. I'm wondering on what the Navajo Housing Authority's latest investment on the latest technology on building homes. I know that we've been seeing even where housing are being printed by the massive machines and building homes using the local dirt from the area in a span of about 6 hours. So these are the latest technologies that are out there. And the current policy, will that allow you or NHA to make purchases to help? And again, it's also diversifying on spending some of these funding. And also, has NHA Board of Commissioners and you as a CEO, how often do you have or maybe if I can make a suggestion, let me make a suggestion on meeting with all the housing entities within the Navajo Nation, such as, we just heard the report from CHID funding, from CDBG funding, it's a Navajo, and also Sandstone Housing. I know Sandstone Housing has a lot of homes on the nation. There's 7 properties. I know that specifically in Kayenta, there are 7 properties, or 30 units, 30 homes that are boarded up. So we could actually have 30 families living in these homes. And in Chochimbito, there are some homes that are boarded up as well. I know that they currently just got out of the NHA lease, I think it is, or the NAHAZA funding part was completely paid off. So what type of, in your leadership position, thinking outside the box, how are you planning on working with Sandstone Housing to fix some of these homes? And some of the other creative ideas to our frontline workers would be, I think our frontline workers all deserve a free home. I mean, we heard from veterans also. So if we could think of maybe meeting dates with these other housing organizations and entities, and collaborative come together and let's break down these silos, and also duplication of services. I hear our people, well, I applied at NHA, I also applied at USDA, and I also applied with nonprofits, and I also applied with veterans. I'm sitting here and waiting for one of them to accept my application. We all come together as Navajo, on Navajo, surrounding Navajo, for just housing. So we look at some of the plans in the future, and however way we can assist. Thank you.
Speaker. Thank you for that, Honorable Brown. that, colleagues, are there any more further questions at this time? If there are none, we go back to you, Mr. Wasetta, and then if you want to go ahead for closeout remarks too as well. Mr. Wasetta, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me, sir?
Yep.
Okay. Honorable Brown, thank you. One of the things that you brought up was looking at latest technology investment. 4 years ago, we looked at 3D printing, what you're talking about, a concrete or natural soils. And this comes to an area, Navajo Housing Authority through Shanto, who looked at doing ram earth construction. And because it's not a conventional bill, it had to go through a model activity. And through the model activity review, and they looked at the cost, and HUD asked for the cost estimate and then versus the traditional. It was over the total development guidelines that they had. So we struggled with them because it was a new technology. HUD did not want to approve that activity. They asked us to look at a more traditional construction. But I think as technology moves forward, and this is something that we could justify some of these areas, but the one thing that we got to be mindful is meeting those areas of the code compliance. I know that we've been part of that discussion in the last 3 months with Division of Community Developments, veterans. How do we apply that here? But those are some of the latest areas that we're looking at. One of the other areas that we're looking at is SIP panels. How can we build that here and just truck it out and set it up after the stem walls and everything's reducing the cost? So I think that's one area that we need to keep the thought pattern going, because every idea is not a stupid idea. It's a great idea to expand the horizon. But I do agree with you. I have met with Ms. Yellowman, Patrick on a couple of areas when we were looking at some projects. In Mr. Jay-Z's office, I even talked with Navajo Nation Employee Housing, because what I'm finding, everybody has a different vision of how we provide housing. So the thing is bringing that together into an area of collaborations to where, all right, how do we handle this to a certain level of assistance? So I encourage that if we can keep that going to make the Navajo Nation better and whole, to improve areas and share, it's like Mr. Franklin, share the data, share the information, so we all know what we're doing as a family member. Because if one family member doesn't know what another family member does, we're not going to be successful. In closing, I guess one of the things is to answer the area of sandstone, Honorable Brown. I have been working with Shelby. I got a USDA contacted us last week asking us to help them with the application, because they still are a recipient of USDA funds under their loans, and they needed somebody to look at applying for some monies to support some of their activities for housing. So that's in the discussion now of where we could bridge that. But the only concern that we have is how is it going to be rolled out in the compliance requirements for meeting in those funds that are going to be attached. One thing that we're working with Shelby under the CARES, we were going to allocate them funding for their operational maintenance of their units. So that's one thing that we finally got the approval from HUD. So we're waiting for the written authorization that we still can assist them, even though that they have satisfied the land use agreement that was for those properties. In closing, honorable delegates, speaker. All I ask for is the support in us working together. And I think I have a lot of knowledge. I used to work with the tribal BIA, and I'd like to use that to areas that we can improve. And this is the same with Mr. Franklin. Let's use technology to help us as we're using technology now to cover a meeting. Let's bring those critical programs together and let's build them, rebuild them with what we have now, like it was rebuilt 87 years ago after the Great Depression. We have the resources, we have the professional minds. Let's use that to the advantage to fill all the areas from child development, daycare areas. One of the things that I'm recommending, I met with child development staff on some of their proposed projects, is that if we can get some of these single parents that are having daycare, it gives them enough time to take their GED, maybe get higher education, because any of that workforce development activity doesn't count against their income limits or their housing programs. Those areas are something that we all need to look at. And as legislators, I will, within my capacity here, to give you that insight and assistance if you ask. I'll leave it with that, but I appreciate your time and your understanding for me moving forward the organization. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Waseda, and thank you very much for your presentation. We look forward to that further discussion, and I guess finalizing that recommendation is something that I would really need, and then putting that into the formal presentation into the pot, if that's something council would like to do, and specifically on building out the homes in these facilities and these areas that you have indicated that's ready to go or have been ready for some time, but you just needed that extra push for infrastructure funds, which I know it's hard to come by when you're limited on an annual basis from the NAHASDA funding that's already set aside for certain different obligations. So again, thank you very much, and thank you very much for bringing before the Naabik'íyáti committee today. That, colleagues, moving on, I just want to thank Mrs. Orline, Dr. Yellowman for bringing back on some of the updates on the housing requirements and recommendations. Looks like there was a possibility of coming back with Department of the Veterans Administration really looking to see if they could revamp their presentation. We'll have Ms. Yazzie reach out to Mr. Orline and push that request, and also meet that requirement, and asking Mr. Paulson Chaco was the chief of staff for that too as well. So again, thank you everyone for being on the line this afternoon and this morning. Colleagues, moving on down to announcements and adjournment of today's work session. We don't have any more work sessions for the rest of the week. We have work sessions starting next Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. But it looks like today is National Recognition of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Persons, or People's Day, and we'll be having activities.
Thank you, Speaker. Wow. Are we done?
have a